Today I am truly giving a lecture. The interesting thing about today's lecture, and again about St. Louis being part of the Upper South, is that we had both enslaved people and free people. But when I give you the numbers, it's really kind of a surprise that I think you'll find it interesting. But we're going to go back to the beginning because the history, causes, and development in the stratification of free people of color. And that has been with us almost from the beginning. Africans originally brought here were not enslaved, but in a state of unfree. They were considered to be indentured service, like the unlanded whites that came. They prospered as there were few in numbers, but that will change when 3 indentured servants, 1 black, 2 white, ran away. When they were recaptured, the Virginia law gave the 2 white men 7 more years of servitude. But the black man, John Punch, was made a servant for life. This is how it starts. In 1661, the Commonwealth of Virginia will pass a law making slavery an inherited condition. Now it has been institutionalized at birth. And what the law said was the condition of the mother is the condition of the child. Okay, so there was no way. Now, up until this time, under British law, the condition of the father is what marked whether you were enslaved, or free. It's mama's baby, daddy's maybe, in this case. So now the mother, they will look at the condition of the mother. So in first time in history, it becomes inherited. You can't get around it now, okay? So, as time goes on, when we have the 3 cultures sitting in one spot and the country starts feeling the pangs of wanting freedom from Great Britain, with the advent of the American Revolution, many northern states from 1774 to 1804 will begin to abolish slavery. Both sides, British and American, will convince blacks to fight for their side with the promise of freedom. After the war, both sides reneged. But in some cases, some blacks had earned their freedom because certain states did allow, like New Jersey, if you fought for them, they did grant the freedom. But a lot of them didn't. After the war, the number of free blacks does increase. In what was considered the regional South, many Southern owners will free their slaves because cotton, at this point, they were growing tobacco, it was wearing out the fields, and it wasn't becoming profitable anymore. So a lot of them just freed their slaves, and this will increase the amount of free blacks in the not quite United States. This causes the number of free blacks to double, and it will double again from 1790 to 1810. Now, there are circumstances that makes this possible. So we've just talked about the beginnings of free blacks in this country. And again, when they first arrived, they were not considered slaves, they were indentured servitude, but they were in a state of unfree, just like indentured servants. These people had to work out their indenture, and so they were not free people either. So this will change in 1661 when it became very obvious that black people were not indigenous to this country, and if they ran off, they could be found. So the condition of the mother becomes the condition of the child. There's 5 contributing factors that makes free people of color possible in this country, and also how we become stratified. One of them is biology. Biologically, Through the long history of slavery, there was always and had been offspring between masters and the enslaved that helped to create a hierarchy among free blacks. Elite blacks were a racially mixed group predicated by the amount of white blood a person of color had. Only 8% of the slaves met the strict requirement at the time of at least 50% or more of white ancestry to become considered a mulatto. This is codified in law in most of the slave states, including Missouri. 31% of free persons of color emancipated were women with various degrees of evident white blood. That their white blood relatives would support them in freedom. There were some who believed that their white parentage was aware of what lighter complexion would mean as far as to what type of life they would have. Also, they were also preferred to be house servants with exposure to better lifestyles, manner, culture, and dress. So, oftentimes, your master was also your father. Sometimes the mistress would insist that this lighter complected woman or child be sold. But oftentimes they were raised in the household as a servant, tolerated, if you will. Light-skinned enslaved persons were more likely to be emancipated, more likely to have a trade or a skilled activity, has more of an opportunity to pass for white, more likely to have an opportunity to receive an education and to own property. So right from the beginning, blood quantum will justify how far you will make it in the very beginning of your emancipation. Sometimes when these people of color were emancipated, their parent would give them money, or say, with restrictions like you have to go to the north or you have to leave. For an example, in Kentucky, emancipated blacks could not live in Kentucky. Most often, you had to leave. A lot of them came to St. Louis. Gravitating towards cities was a better chance for making it, and it gave you a heads up, or a good head start. So biological, the amount of white blood that you had, the lighter that you were, will also will start this stratification within black society. Now also, if you were lighter complected, you worked in the big house, you dressed better, you probably had access to better food, and that will start the stratification within the black community itself. Most of the field slaves would look at the house slaves as pampered. They looked at them as they thought they were better than field slaves, and it will start within the community itself. Cultural differences. Through the long history of slavery, there was always been an offspring, again, between masters and enslaved to create a hierarchy among free slaves. Cultural differences were 90% of enslaved blacks were illiterate, and close to 75% of free blacks were educated. It will take 50 years after slavery before the black population reflected that 50% number. There was a frame of mind among these racially mixed people, fair-complected aristocrats, that color pervaded their thinking and determined their behavior. They intermarried among themselves, and usually not to anyone darker complected than themselves. The elites were distinguished by education, comportment, and gentile performance. They were always aware that they were not upper-class Americans, but considered upper-class Negro Americans, whose African blood identified them with people they considered inferior by the larger society. Elites were a closed society, and was home-based, included activities such as whist parties, soirees, musicales, and small receptions. They did not display their wealth. Their outside of their homes was considered to match everybody else's on the street, but it was inside where you would find the Persian carpets, the oil paintings, the piano. They didn't display. They were very low key. Part of that, they learned to stay under the radar of their white contemporaries. They worshiped at denominations that were based on an intellectual form of worship that did not include any of the antics like loud singing, preachers who were prancing about, which they considered not religious but performance-based religion. The denominations that they practiced were Protestant Episcopal, Presbyterian, and the Catholic Church. These choices were based on, in some cases, the worship of their white families that became institutionalized with generational freedom. Also, once again, these churches were considered highbrow. Some of these churches did practice had discriminating practices such as pew renting and refusing to admit new members unless they could pass the brown paper test. You could not join certain Episcopal and Presbyterian black churches if you were darker than a brown paper bag. Okay, so this is how they kept themselves apart from the black masses. They considered, even though white people only saw one color, they held themselves apart, as a race apart, than the black masses. The congregations, in most cases, needless to say, were small in size, relatively well educated and prosperous, and the services were sedate by black standards. The upper class women after the Civil War will turn their attention to civic, cultural uplift, and other clubs to give them a life outside the home, yet still take care of the home. Uplift projects like education, domestic training skills for the newly arrived from the South will become causes among these women. Being shut out of white women's organizations, they created their own literary and music clubs. Though some of the earliest Black history organizations were created by these club women. In Boston, Florida Ruffin Ridley founded the Society for the Collection of Negro Folklore, and in Philadelphia, the American Negro Historical Society of Philadelphia, which is still an organization 130 years later. A study was done in 1944 that stated that upper and middle class blacks belonged to more voluntary associations than darker complected lower class blacks. Often these clubs tended to be restrictive in membership and to include only those whose behavior and lifestyle conformed to genteel performance. When we talk about economic achievement, these people already have an upper hand. First of all, they were freed very early, probably in the 18th and early 19th century, before the Civil War, and they will gravitate toward cities. There were several reasons for that. Regional distribution. The geographic center for black population drifted southwest with the arrival of the cotton gin of about 50 miles per decade, while 90% of the free people were moving in the opposite direction. Urbanization. In 1830, blacks made up almost a quarter of the population in St. Louis. Over the next 3 decades, the number of blacks declined dramatically, so that they constituted only 2% of the city's population on the eve of the Civil War. The city's early high numbers were in part due to the policies of the French and Spanish governments. They were liberal in their attitudes of race mixing as opposed to the arrival of the Americans with statehood. By 1860, there were more free blacks, for example, in Washington, D.C., than in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama combined. In Alabama America, free blacks of color were more urbanized than white America. It would be 1940 before the black population as a whole would be as urbanized as the 1860 free black society. There were many examples of mixed race people who were born enslaved yet made vast amounts of money in antebellum America. Some because of the modest starts where they were given their freedom, others by acute business acumen, but were all working aristocrats. Many gens du couleur were boatmen, stewards on boats, who, along with a salary, made vast amounts of money by tips from the service they provided to the white constituency. The tonsorial arts were another avenue in Southern society. White men would not have another white man to minister to them, but it was fitting for a black man to shave, cut their hair, and otherwise act as temporary manservants. In St. Louis, the very best tonsorial establishments were owned and operated by the best of the colored Creoles. There were many professions that blacks excelled at, such as restaurant owners, hotel owners, and catering. Elizabeth Keckley, who was a modiste who made exquisite gowns for both Miss Robert E. Lee and Mary Todd Lincoln, had her dress shop here on 7th Street. And when Abraham Lincoln is elected to Washington, if you know or not know, Elizabeth Keckley moved into the White House to keep dressing Mary Todd Lincoln. She made her look good, and that was rough. Second and third generations of free blacks were the teachers, doctors, and leaders of black society. For no matter how fair complected, when white society looked at them, they only saw one color. And these mixed race people were subject to the same discriminatory laws that their darker skinned cousins that they were trying to get away from. So we see how they rise from the beginning. Biology played a major part of that, especially when we see 31% of the people who were emancipated were women with high percentages of white blood. And again, I want to go back to that comment, to that sentence. A woman of color who was very light complected and still enslaved had a very rough life, okay? Oftentimes, they were sold to the South as what was called a fancy, which means that they were sold to become a mistress of some plantation owner. They were sold into brothels. And our own Bernard M. Lynch's slave market here, he specialized in fancies down in New Orleans. So it was very difficult, and a lot of times their fathers or their white relatives freed them as a form of protection. And something else I'd like to add about the education. Wilberforce down in Ohio and Oberlin up in northern Ohio were both institutes of higher learning that were integrated, especially Wilberforce. Wilberforce, being so close to the South, was financed and created by white slave owners to send their colored offspring to university. This is the beginning of Wilberforce. Then Oberlin, which is, so far north, though it was a white institution, from the very beginning, it accepted black students. Our own James Milton Turner went there. John Barry Meacham's two sons went to Oberlin, and the same thing. But in Oberlin's case, they acted through, these white parents acted through an intermediary they didn't directly enroll their children. There would be someone else to hide their involvement with these children. So education They will, by second and third generation after freedom, become the leaders of black society because of their education. Now, one more story I'll tell you really quickly, or actually two. Anybody ever hear the name Blanche Kelso Bruce? Blanche Kelso Bruce would be one of the black men that is sent to Congress during Reconstruction. But he's a senator from Mississippi. Actually, he will take over Robert E. Lee's place. But he is the only one that will continue his entire 6-year term in the Senate. Blanche Kelso Bruce was actually born in Virginia. His master will move to Kentucky for a minute, and then he will settle here in Lafayette County in Missouri. The master had another son, had a son, and his wife died in childbirth. But at the same time, this black slave woman that he owned had just given birth. So she suckled both boys. They were only a few days apart, and they grew up together as brothers. And some people think that that was not by accident, that they literally were brothers. So Mr. Bruce brought the best tutors that he could for his son. But because the boys were inseparable, Blanche Kelso Bruce, who is technically a slave, had a classic education. When the Civil War broke out, the son, the white son, decided to fight for the Confederacy, and he wanted Blanche to go with him. Blanche told him, I don't think so. And so he left. They didn't force him. But as the master's son goes this way, Blanche takes his master's second best horse and heads due west to Kansas. When he gets to Kansas, because he's educated, he will open up colored schools around Lawrence. When the Civil War broke out, as it continued, when black men could join, he tried to join, but he was turned down. So what he did, he stayed in Missouri and will create the first black schools around Hannibal and Pike County. After the Civil War, he will go down to Mississippi to Bolivar, buy a rundown plantation and turn it into a serious money-making factory. No, he did it by paid labor and not by slavery. And while he's down in Mississippi, he is a man considered of such character, moral character. He spoke beautifully, they said, had a very lyrical voice, and they send him to Congress. He becomes the second senator from Mississippi in Congress. He will serve his entire term. But when his term is over, and by the way, he will become the first black man who will be speaker for the Senate. So he doesn't, when his term is over, he doesn't leave Washington, D.C. He's so well liked by everyone. He's given several different government positions, including in charge of the Custom House. But reason why I'm telling you this, more than anything else, during that time, one of his appointments that I tell you that I am most proud of, because I own two of them, from 1881 to 1885, Blanche Kelso Bruce was the registered treasurer of the United States. Every bill printed from $1 to 100 has this black man's signature. Every bill. I own two of them. And if I had a thought, I'd have sent a copy of the slide. And it's called The Notes That He Signed. On the back of it, our dollar bills used to be like these gorgeous pictures. They were about this big. And it's called the Woodcutter's Note. And has a man with an axe, a child and over his shoulder, a child and a dog, and there's fallen trees behind him, okay? And it's called the Woodcutter's Note. But from 81 to 85, he was Treasurer of the United States. But he could pass for a white man. Again, that color, but in his case, because his master had educated him from a child, but that was also his father. Second case. Oh, by the way, he will die. He was only 57 years old. When he got married in Washington, D.C., he married another woman of color who was, she was less than an octoroon. You could not tell her from a white woman, though she was. And we're talking, and Josephine Bruce will be one of the founders of the National Colored Women's Association. And she wanted to run for president in 1890 something. And the black woman said, no, you're not going to represent us. You don't even look black, okay? So they refused her, and she was one of the founders. And that's what she wanted, to become the president. The last person I'm going to talk about is Pelagie Rutger. Anybody know who she is? Okay. Pelagie Rutger was born a slave here in 1803. Mother was enslaved. Father was a French fur trapper. And on an expedition up to the Minnesota territories, he's going to be killed. We believe that Pelagie and her mother must have been owned by somebody in her father's family, because Pelagie was able to buy her freedom for only $3, and she was worth probably $900. So she will start, her and her mother will start the first public laundry here in the little frontier town. She gets married at a young age to St. Eutrope Clay Morgan, and she's going to be talking to you about the Clay Morgan family that is the foundation of most of colored aristocracy in St. Louis. And St. Eutrope, his mother died when he was very young. There's four kids, 3 boys and a girl, and she will die very young. But his godfather, who was in charge, because this little boy, all 4 of these children, were the grandchildren of Jacques Clay Morgan, who was very big in the fur trading community, and in fact was made syndic here in St. Louis by the Spanish. And if you don't know what syndic meant, and as Linda Wood, I would tell my students, and get this really straight, under the Spanish, there was a syndic on the west side of the Missouri River, and it was syndic on this side. Daniel Boone was the syndic on the west side. Jack Clay Morgan was the syndic on the east side. What does syndic mean? Lawgiver. He was the judge. Any case that my cow ran, trampled everything in your garden, and now you want compensation. He was lawgiver under the Spanish. Same economic parity that Daniel Boone had on the other side of the river. But yet, nobody knows this, okay? He was lawgiver here. Now, so St. Eutrope, when Jacques Clay Morgan dies, this man was 73 when he had his first child. He had 4 children by 3 black women in succession, okay? So needless to say, he got to see none of them grow up, all right? So he died. His daughter will have 7 kids by a white live-in boyfriend, and she will die early as well. So Anton Soulard, the Anton Soulard, will become godfather to the Clay Morgan children. When St. Eutrope becomes of age, Clay Morgan thinks it's best, because as a gens du couleur, as a gentleman of color, he needs to go to Europe to learn the tonsorial arts. So his godfather, Anton Soulard, will pay for him, will let him use some of his inheritance to go to Europe to study, but also to bring back crystal chandeliers and marble tubs. And when he gets back to St. Louis, he opens up Clay Morgan's, which will rival any tonsorial establishment anywhere in the United States. Well, at that time, we were meeting over on the Missouri River. All the men over there hammering out the Missouri Constitution. So he opens up a small barbershop over in St. Charles. Pelagie and their infant daughter goes too. But one of the epidemics, I don't know if it was malaria or cholera, kills the baby and then kills him. Pelagie closes the St. Charles barbershop and disappears for a while. When she comes back to St. Louis, and some historians say she went down to Louisiana to her white father's family. But when she came back, she brings 3 trunks of clothes, and she's been off the frontier and has become very sophisticated. She sets her sights on the next eligible bachelor in St. Louis, which is Louis Rutger, the illegitimate son of Aaron Rutger, a massive landowner who owned pretty much a lot of the land between Soulard and Carondelet. So Louis is Aaron's only child, okay? He does have, only illegitimate. He's his only son. He does have 2 half-sisters. So now she is Pelagie Clay Morgan Rutger, all right? So when Aaron dies, Louis inherits almost everything his father left. Pelagie, now this is interesting because Pelagie never learned to read and write, but Pelagie had so much money, an executive from Boatman's Bank came every Saturday to her house to reconcile her books, and she knew within 3 cents where every penny of her money was. She had land, and she never got rid of it. Her and Louis were married 12 years before they have their only child, Alouette, and this child is beautiful, but in Clay Morgan's book, The Colored Aristocracy, he doesn't talk really good about her intelligence, okay? So before her mother's getting ill, and she decided she can't leave all her property to Alouette and starts looking for a husband. The husband she chooses is James P. Thomas. And James P. Thomas was a steward, captain of the stewards on a major riverboat. But his history was his white father was actually a Supreme Court judge from Kentucky, and his mother had been enslaved. Father freed both of them, and he will work, James P. Thomas will work on the riverboat. He is worth a lot of money. So Alouette has a lot of land, a lot of income coming in from rents. He has a lot of money that he has earned on the riverboat. He also, when he came off the riverboat, will join the Clay Morgan concern as a barber. This young family, when they get married, just want to read to you quickly what happened when this young couple gets married. The bride's veil, and this was reported in the New York Times about this colored wedding out here on the frontier. The wedding veil was $900. The material for her dress cost $1,400, and she wore a pair of $5,000 matched diamond earrings. It is estimated that he was worth over $250,000. You want to know what that is in today's money? Multiply it times 11. We are talking 1857. That, again, this colored aristocracy, it is said Pelagie Rutger was the richest black woman and on economic parity with Shaw, okay, with Henry Shaw. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. So now you got 2 people that were part of the aristocracy, but Blanche Kelso Bruce, every bill printed has a black man's signature. Okay? Thank you.
It's humbling to follow in Angela Da Silva's footsteps, but I'll do my best. Despite persistent racism and restricted rights, some free black residents became wealthy and well-respected in 19th century St. Louis. And in addition to the over 1,000 free black St. Louisans who owned small businesses, were laborers or worked assorted jobs, there was an elite group of African-American St. Louisans called the Black aristocracy, which Angela has already told you so much about. They were large landowners and business people, many descending from some of St. Louis's earliest residents, and thus having French Catholic heritage. As Angela has told us, several owned large barber emporiums, while others owned drayage businesses, which moved goods from steamboat to steamboat and worked on the levee. And several of these barbers, including Albert White, William Johnson, and James Thomas, had personal wealth at that time between $15,000 and $125,000 in the 1850s. Antoine Labadie, a cattle dealer, owned a business worth $300,000. And still others, like Madame Pelagie Rutgers, owned huge tracts of land, which the family sold at great profit as the city expanded. And one source claims she owned nearly all the homes on her block, and far more than I realized, as I just learned. This elite group had its own social season and debutante balls. And it's really quite amazing what sources we have about this group. But one of the sources which leads us to know so much about this Black elite social class in St. Louis is a pamphlet called The Colored Aristocracy of St. Louis, written by Cyprian Klamorgan in 1858. The only known copy in existence is held here at the Missouri Historical Society archives. And Cyprian Klamorgan himself was part of this social class, and he used his position within these circles to document the lives of his peers in short biographies of 43 free Black St. Louisans and their contributions to the city. Now, Klamorgan had multiple agendas with this publication, and I'm going to invite you to see if you can learn more about what his goals were. When you walked in, you should have received one of the biographies, one of the profiles of a member of the Black aristocracy in St. Louis that Klamorgan wrote about in this pamphlet. And I'm going to invite one or two of you using the microphone to share with us, based on what you're able to see there, what do you think Klamorgan is trying to do with this publication? What are his goals? We have a hand up front here.
Can I ask you to wait for the microphone because we're recording?
Can you hear me?
No, we're going to use a microphone because we're recording. Yes.
I read that book a long time ago, and my first reaction was, especially after I read it the second time, that he was trying to blackmail members of the Black aristocracy to keep them out of his book.
Interesting take.
You know, kind of like the cheap magazines that you can now get about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reads
Hollywood.
very much like a gossip magazine in some ways. Is there one other person who'd like to share their reflections? Well, Klamorgan's book very much was gossipy, but it was much more than just a gossip magazine. It's both a work of entertainment and a social and political commentary. And while it's in some ways equivalent of a who's who in St. Louis, it's also very satirical and is making a wry, larger social commentary similar to that which we might see in The Onion today. And I meant for this slide to be able to zoom in so you can see some of what he said, but Klamorgan is catering both to a white audience and to a Black audience, and he has different purposes with each of those audiences. Historian Julie Winch writes that Cyprian Klamorgan set out to challenge a white audience that Black people were not all alike, that race was not absolute, and that the Black community was not a monolith, that class, education, and especially wealth should count for something. She writes that Cyprian Klamorgan judged the moment right to publish a short account of a world few white people knew anything about. The result was a series of witty and entertaining vignettes, which you have around you, linked by a serious message about race, class, and power. Always the opportunist, Cyprian Klamorgan had an eye to potential sales, and he was certainly not adverse to publicity. It was bound to attract attention to in St. Louis itself and probably elsewhere in Missouri, because at this time in 1858, the status of men and women of color was exciting, intense debate across the nation immediately following the Dred Scott decision of 1857, decided the year before, which had its origins here in St. Louis. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were now contending over political control of St. Louis and of Missouri, and would continue to do so in the tumultuous years ahead. And Glamorgan steps into this fray to make a comment about where we're at as a society when it comes to race. Glamorgan says, white people might thumb through this book's pages because they thought it promised amusing and possibly scurrilous anecdotes, or because they were outraged by the very notion of a black aristocracy and were eager to read Glamorgan's arguments so they could demolish them. As for free people of color, who among them could resist seeing whether Glamorgan had included him in his aristocracy or reading what he had to say about their neighbors? And with a name like Glamorgan, he was assured of a readership. Who better to comment on the black aristocracy of St. Louis than a man whose family had been a vital part of that aristocracy for decades? So the pamphlet is witty, sarcastic, satirical of both white and black people, and is a work of entertainment and commentary. So as a result, we can't fully take these accounts at face value, because as Glamorgan, on top of his own biases, was embellishing for the entertainment of his readers, describing, like in a celebrity magazine, who were the charming, eligible ladies and who were the scoundrels. Esther, who Angela just told us a little bit about, was a formerly enslaved woman who, in many ways, is one of the matriarchs of this free dynasty of color in St. Louis. Many members of the black elite is descended from Esther. She's a woman of mixed African and European ancestry who was enslaved and a concubine of fur trader, land speculator, and credit lender Jacques Glamorgan, who himself is believed to have mixed racial heritage. And we could talk about Esther Glamorgan for a whole hour because she has an incredible story, and I encourage you to read Julie Winch's book on the Glamorgans to learn more. But while she was enslaved by Jacques Glamorgan, she began to save up money to free herself, but Jacques Glamorgan took that as an opportunity for himself and offered to free her and to pay her $50 for each year he would stay with her. And after she was free, he began putting his land titles and property titles into her name to avoid getting followed up by creditors who were trying to collect debts from him. Now, the relationship, whatever relationship we can say Esther and Jacques Glamorgan had, increasingly deteriorated as he increasingly became more and more violent and took on other enslaved consorts. And so one day Esther collected these papers that she knew Jacques had, some of which she had signed, and left. And she ended up finding out through a lawyer she hired when Jacques tried to claim, no, this is my land, it's not hers, and take it back, that she owned a vast amount of property. And she worked with this lawyer to defend her land rights until Jacques Glamorgan convinced that lawyer to switch to his side and help him defraud her. And Esther Glamorgan and her descendants would continue to sue for reclamation of their property through 1848, through several generations. So there were several elite mixed-race dynasties in St. Louis: the Glamorgans, the Creviers, the Aubuchons, the Labadis, the Charlevilles, and the Wreckers. The Charlevilles and Labadis alone had several marriages between their family and had social and business relationships that lasted well into the 20th century. They traded property and even enslaved people and posted bond for one another on several occasions. I think I may have clicked wrong, or something's a little bit out of order here, I apologize. So this is the slide. My apologies. Yeah, something's a little bit off. But we'll go here. So who has the card for Robert J. Wilkinson, R.J. Wilkinson? We're going to delve a little bit more into what Cyprian Glamorgan had to say about some of his peers. Does anyone have R.J. Wilkinson? Would you be willing to share some of what you observed about how Glamorgan characterized him?
I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Ah, sorry to put you on the spot then.
I've got the cover.
Well, we can read it out loud together. So, Glamorgan describes him as another dealer in steel and soap, so a barber, who came to St. Louis 16 years ago from Cincinnati. He opened a small shop on Vine Street where a majority of his customers were rivermen. And although indebted to steamboatmen for his start in life, he has frequently taken occasion to slander that noble class of men whose good qualities are too well known to require any eulogy in this place. The cause of Wilkinson leaving Cincinnati was the seduction of an interesting girl whose friends swore vengeance against her destroyer. He afterwards married a native of St. Louis whose connections enabled him to obtain admission into society, and his youthful indiscretions have been regarded with a forgiving eye. He has a fine establishment on Olive Street between 4th and 5th and is doing a good business. His estate is worth about $21,000. He resides on Clark Avenue near 15th. I'm sorry to say his character is not such as one should be recommended to the young as a model of excellence. He is ungrateful for favors past and speaks disrespectfully of those who have been his best friends. He employs good workmen, and his shop is one of the most frequented in the city. So how does Glamorgan characterize Wilkinson here? And do we trust it? They're in competition as barbers in the city, for one. It's hard to say what of this is true and what isn't. But some of what we know about Bob Wilkinson beyond Glamorgan's text is that he was a prosperous barber and free black resident in St. Louis. And he was originally from Pennsylvania and moved to St. Louis in the mid-1830s, originally selling soap and other toiletries. And in 1848, he established a barber shop at 38 Vine Street. And within 2 years, his establishment was worth $8,000. And he was running a successful business. And there's advertisements you can find in the newspaper from that era stating that he specialized in shaving, fashionable hair cutting, and particular attention to cutting the hair of children. And he was hired to work at the Southern Hotel at 4th and Walnut in 1866, 1 year after the Civil War ended. And this hotel was the most luxurious hotel in St. Louis, and it made Wilkinson very wealthy. A feature in the New York Tribune said that in 1871, he had a personal fortune of $25,000. He married twice, was the father of 14 children, and is buried at Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. And this is the slide I was trying to show you earlier of the Lavides and Charlevilles and their family relationships. Now, you just learned a lot about Pelagie Records from Angela. Do any of you have Angela's bio? Or, sorry, excuse me. I'm so sorry. Pelagie's bio. Pelagie, yeah. Would you be willing to share some of what you discovered from it?
It sounds like she was not very well educated, that she was wealthy, and she had a daughter that was, I think we already said that was beautiful but a little stupid. And but otherwise, that's kind of what I'm gathering here. She was the daughter. She became requested Lewis actress, chief guardian for her estate. Lewis Clay Morgan did that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of some of the tidbits I got on her.
Yeah. So Cyprian Glamorgan does not have nice things to say about Pelagie Records. So Rutgers became wealthy by investing in real estate and had substantial holdings in the St. Louis area, as we learned. She rented commercial buildings and tenements to white businessmen, and estimates of her wealth ran as high as $500,000, making her the richest African American in St. Louis. Her first husband, Jacques St. Eutrope Clamorgan, was Cyprian Clamorgan's uncle. So when Cyprian's writing this about Pelagi, he's writing about a relative by marriage, and clearly did not have high opinions of her. So how do we balance out this story? What can we know about Pelagi, and whether there's any truth to what Clamorgan is saying, or if this is just some personal beef between each other? According to Cyprian Clamorgan, Mrs. Rutgers' wealth was highly visible through her lavish lifestyle and the materials she owned, such as a piano estimated to cost $2,000 at the time. And when she died in 1867, at age 65, she was one of the wealthiest people in the city. And scholar Andrew Wegman says that in comparison to what Cyprian Clamorgan has to say about her, the truth is that Pelagi Rutgers represented her community perfectly, and that nearly everyone agreed. Though she was a Rutgers, she spoke French with her friends and actively sought to create a legacy both for herself and her daughter within the community. Upon her death, she left several $100s to St. Vincent Catholic Church and left an additional sum of $100 for the creation of the first Catholic colored orphan asylum to be established in the city of St. Louis. And her wealth, influence, and landowning are the reason we have Rutgers Street named after her and her husband today. Angela told you about her daughter, Iolette, or Antoinette Rutgers. This was Pelagi Rutgers' only daughter, and she was very protective of her. Wegman says that Pelagi Rutgers closely controlled her daughter's suitors in what we can only suggest a conscious effort to erase her own enslaved past. She reportedly rejected Antoinette's proposed marriage to James Peck Thomas, an extremely successful barber from Nashville, Tennessee. And she did this because she saw that he was dark-skinned and born to an enslaved person. And even though she had also been born into slavery, she went so far as to state in her will that all the funds, $60,000 of her fortune left to Antoinette, were left to her sole and separate use and control, and could only be controlled by Antoinette because she didn't want this money to fall into James Peck Thomas's hands or anyone else's. But the couple had their way, and they married in 1868, a year after Pelagi's death. In St. Louis newspapers, you heard about the grandeur of her veil and her dress, reported that their wedding at St. Vincent Church was one of the most magnificent ever performed in the city, and that many of the elite of the city were present. Now, as little as Pelagi Rutgers regarded James Peck Thomas, Cyprian Clamorgan had a much higher regard of him. And he had plenty of reputation and wealth in his own right. He was born enslaved to Sally Thomas and enslaver and Tennessee Supreme Court Justice John Catron, who later decided against Dred and Harriet Scott's suit for freedom and denied citizenship to free black people like his son in the infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision. Even while enslaved, Thomas participated in a variety of cultural activities typically enjoyed by middle and upper class white and free black people, such as musical and operatic concerts, theaters, and political rallies. And he managed to quietly increase his personal fortune to several $1,000s, and he and his mother worked to purchase his freedom. And he used his proceeds to buy his first piece of real estate for $3,000 in the 1850s, and then worked to expand his holdings throughout the Midwest, speculating for land in Iowa and Kansas for low prices that would grow over time. And he later moved to St. Louis, and through his real estate speculation and his advantageous marriage to Antoinette Rutgers, became one of the wealthiest African Americans in the city. Scholars have said that his business and financial success were due to his dexterity as a razor, his experience as a barber, and with being able to work the delicate and precarious social dance of being a person in this Black elite who's mingling with white people, who's shaving the beards, cutting the hair of white people, and being part of a Black world. And he was able to use his experience to perform deference to his patrons and assume a quiet manner that enabled his patrons to trust him. And he was able to gain access to privy information that enabled him to shape his own social, economic, and political influence going forward. And so while paying attention to and influencing politics in his barbershop, Thomas watched as Dred Scott walked down 4th Street daily to the courthouse for his suit that his own father would eventually decide against. By 1870, Thomas was the richest Black person in the state of Missouri and controlled more than 5% of the total property owned by Black Missourians. And in 1873, he visited the famous Black American sculptor Edmonia Lewis at her studio in Rome and commissioned these 2 busts of him and Antoinette. And Thomas, I've learned, was also pretty significant in the art world himself, especially in portraiture, though I don't know much about his own work. By 1873, his fortune had reached its highest. He oversaw an estate valued at $250,000 and owned a luxury barbershop at the Linda Hotel in downtown St. Louis that made about $2,000 a month. He ended up retiring shortly after that and wrote his own autobiography, where he comments, just like Glamorgan, in a wry but more serious fashion about the matters of race that he experienced and participated in St. Louis. Like Glamorgan's tell-all, it's a critical commentary on race and class relations in the US. And when he died, reports of his massive funeral at St. Vincent were described just as imposingly as his marriage. Now, these families have legacies that I think many in the audience are well aware go on for generations and endure to the present. And we already know of Rutgers Street, named for Lewis and Pelagie Rutgers, and the extensive land they owned there. But streets like Glamorgan are named for Jacques Glamorgan and Labadie for Antoine Labadie, who are members of this group. And Pelagie Rutgers is the great-grandmother of Mrs. Pelagie Green Wren, who was the first Black person to join St. Louis's Muni Orchestra Dance Chorus in 1962 at age 19. In integrating the Muni Chorus, her participation was so unfathomable that she received threats to her life just for dancing and had to have a bodyguard attend to her. She married one of these bodyguards, Charles Wren, and opened a dance studio on Del Mar and taught dance in St. Louis public schools for 30 years. So this is an incredibly rich legacy in St. Louis and continues to shape our community today. And I'll wrap it up there.